Welcome to NoCap Game Design. In this episode, we take a look at the 5th level of Halo Combat Evolved titled Assault on the Control Room. This is the first level where the player spawns in alone, with no computer allies for support. Additionally, the player's guns are only partly loaded, further driving the feeling that the Master Chief is in for a rough fight.
The Covenant presence here
About half this level takes place indoors, and the level architecture for this indoor section is a collection of combat encounter rooms, much like this one. Generally, each room has a feature in the middle. This one has a large chasm for the player, or aliens, to fall to their deaths. There are some elevated positions, forcing the player to look up from time to time, and the center area is ringed with debris-filled hallways. In the first episode, I talked about putting debris and other stuff in combat hallways. They're cover points for the players or for aliens. They're not here to be realistic, only to enhance the combat experience of this area. Generally, the center area has less cover than the edges, and the player always is a few steps away from a vantage point of the center area, enabling a player to keep a pretty good situational awareness at all times. But not perfect. There are still some hidden corners for the devs to spawn in enemies or spring traps on the player. But that's the formula. There are several variations of this theme. For example, this room has an elevated structure that the player needs to storm. Simply running up into the structure is not a smart move, so the player needs to take a different strategy or use some other resource, like rockets, to get in there. Here are two slightly more bland encounter rooms. Unlike the chasm or the structure room that we've looked at, these rooms don't force the player to change their playstyle. Effectively, they're just rooms with random debris. They don't pose any new questions or challenges to the player, they just exist passively as a stage for combat. Which is fine, but these encounters do get repetitive, and I believe the devs could have done a little more to spice things up. What kind of rooms would you design? Perhaps more traps? Maybe a room with only catwalks for grunts? How about a maze room? Coming up with your own design is good practice. Now, when a player enters one of these rooms, we'll notice that on the left here, there's a group of enemies which act to draw the player in that direction. But on the opposite side to the right, there is this large wall blocking the player. On the other side of this wall is the exit to the room. Here, the developers are stretching out the encounter by blocking the path to the exit. This forces the player to go in the opposite direction and actually engage with the content, which is good design. Setting up the level so a player naturally moves to engage with the content and, well, play the game, that's good design. And as discussed in previous episodes, any kind of circular, hectic, chaotic combat encounter, it's important to provide a clear signal for the forward direction afterwards. The player is already primed with the color green, and this magically flashing lights further draws the attention to this door. But it's these arrows that help point the player in the correct direction. Notice the entrance to this encounter room gets the same flashing light treatment, but the arrow is facing the other way. Maybe the devs should have locked this door, but a player may want to go backwards to reload or pick up a different gun depending on the situation in the current room. After a few hectic circular encounters, the devs hit the player with some linear combat in the form of this bridge. Now, the last time we discussed linear combat was all the way back in level 1, but to summarize, linear combat is controlled by the devs. There's only one direction to go, that way. So what has changed since level 1? Well, the player is more skilled, and therefore requires a more complicated and challenging encounter in order to stay engaged. Here in level 5, Assault on the Control Room, the player is alone and with low ammo. This increases the challenge. The complexity comes from the level design itself. This bridge has an upper and lower section, so a player must pay attention to the enemies in front of them, but also the enemies below or above them. This bridge also has some traps. These glass panels can cause the player to fall and suddenly be surrounded by enemies. This is how the devs make a simple linear combat encounter match an experienced player's skills, by adding a second floor, a second encounter literally on top of the first one, effectively forcing the player to fight two encounters at once. Later in this level, there's another bridge encounter, but instead of layering the two linear encounters, the devs place a parallel bridge next to the first. Here, in this bridge, the player is pulled forward into the encounter by the enemies on the primary bridge, but the side encounter is always there, peppering the player with excitement and danger. There's no good cover for both forward and to the side, so the player is always flanked. Standing still and waiting for a shield to recharge means death. There's always something that demands the player's attention here. So while this encounter is technically linear, the player's attention is actively pulled in two different directions at the same time, resulting in a pretty memorable action sequence. On the return direction on the other side of the bridge, the devs aren't satisfied with grunts peppering the player anymore, so they deploy some hunters to tenderize the player. This is a good example of difficulty scaling. Introduce a design or mechanic to the player, let them learn how to solve the encounter in their own way, then reuse the exact same design but with one element of it changed. Striking this balance of familiarity versus change is hard, but as a rule of thumb, only change one thing at a time. Here is the last bridge of the entire level. So how did the devs make this encounter different and exciting? Well, this bridge has different texture, some natural arch formation, but also there are these really annoying banshees that are showering fire down onto the player. This bridge has no cover to protect the Master Chief from an aerial assault. The result is panic. Run, get into cover, you're exposed, get out of there. It really seems like the devs are bored of simple linear combat. There has to be something else going on, something to increase the complexity, challenge, or chaos of the encounter. As a final observation to the level architecture, I want to draw your attention to how the developers are mixing their content here. In previous levels, the first half was outdoors, while the second half was indoors. In this level, it's more evenly mixed. There are roughly 2 or 3 indoor encounters and then an outdoor encounter. But they're mixing more than just the art assets. The devs are constantly shifting between circular hectic combat rooms, linear combat hallways, a cramped indoor gameplay versus expansive outdoor campaigns. This one level has a little bit of everything, and they're constantly shifting between it, which ups the cognitive complexity, ultimately increasing the challenge. Moving on, this level has some good examples of supply drops. As a developer, you have to provide tools, mechanics, or content to the player. In Halo, those tools are guns and ammunitions. I'll have to find some time to talk about the alien guns in a future episode, but for now I'll focus on the human weapons. As a level progresses, the human weapons slowly drain of ammo. So if the devs want to promote the usage of this content, they need to provide the player with some resupplies. Generally speaking, there are 3 places a developer can place a supply cache, either before an encounter, during an encounter, or after an encounter. A supply cache before an encounter can be thought of as a signal telling the player to prepare and get ready for an upcoming challenge. A supply cache after an encounter can be thought of as a reward, while a supply cache during an encounter is a little bit more rare, but is typically a power-up or an unexpected temporary boost, an exotic tool. Here's an encounter that I think is a good example. It has each of the 3 types of supply drops that I'm talking about. First, the devs present the player with this Crashed Pelican, which provides a rocket launcher, an assault rifle, and a pistol. The fact that the guns themselves are provided is important, and allows a player to select their preferred loadout going into this upcoming encounter. During the encounter, the blood splatters draw a player's attention to another supply drop. Notice the invisibility power-up here, a temporary boon to help the player right away. An especially adaptive player may see this, pick it up, and suddenly change their strategy for the rest of the encounter. And finally, after the encounter, we find a morbid trail of bodies leading to a reward. Some rocket launcher ammunition, and eventually a health pack. Notice here, there is no rocket launcher gun. This supply drop is not telling the player to prepare, but instead rewarding the player for holding on to the rocket launcher. An oversimplified summary is as follows. Supplies before an encounter should allow a player to adjust their loadout and toolset. Supplies during an encounter should provide an immediate, easy-to-use benefit to the player. And a supply drop after an encounter should allow a player to heal up and reload, but not swap out tools. Now, this advice is specific to first-person shooter games, and even this generalization isn't always followed. The important principle to take away here is that a developer should place supplies and tools with intention. Simply placing guns and health packs around the map randomly is not satisfying, nor is it good design. Understanding when and why a player would want a resupply is paramount. At what point does the average player run out of ammo? Why provide a sniper rifle to a player who's about to go indoors? If there's a tank or a hunter pack coming up, how would the player deal with them? Perhaps providing a rocket launcher would be appreciated. Notice here, this resupply provides the player with an opportunity to totally overhaul their loadout. It'll take a few moments for a player to pick up weapons or get into the Warthog, and even more time for the allies to pile into it. But there's an encounter going on. It's dangerous to stand still. Perhaps this conflicting design was done intentionally, forcing a player to think quick and build a sense of panicked urgency, but it does seem a little sloppy to me. Again, let me repeat the core design principle here because I think it's important. A developer should place supplies and tools with intention. I put it in the thumbnail, so I've got to talk about the Scorpion tank. This is the first level that features the tank, and it's quite powerful. Unlimited high explosive rounds and an endless machine gun are two quite powerful weapons. I don't think anyone would disagree. The Scorpion tank has a lot of firepower. At first glance, it seems like the tank is a fix-all for this game. That the tank is so powerful that it will win any encounter that it's thrown into. And yes, it is powerful, but it doesn't trivialize the game. It's not an instant I win card for the player. Notice here, these two hunters demolish the tank in a few seconds. What's happening here is that the player's shields are the same. It seems like your defenses would go up when you're in a tank, but the Master Chief's shields don't become more effective while sitting in it. Additionally, a big tank like this is fairly slow, or at least it can't change directions quickly, making it difficult to dodge. It also presents a massive hitbox for an enemy AI, which seem to prioritize it, further making the poor defenses of the tank problematic. The camera angle is also different, with respect to the tip of the turret. Every other gun in this game is held in the same angle in the same position of the screen, so if the player learns how to shoot one gun, they can shoot all the guns equally effectively. But not the Scorpion tank. On the screen, notice the faint blue dash right in the middle of the crosshairs. It's a alien stationary turret, and it looks like it's lined up for a perfect shot. But this debris thing is in the way, blocking the shot. And even with slight adjustments, it still won't connect. Ultimately, the player needs to reposition to get the shot. Generally, I would consider this bad game design. Notice that all the guns in this game have the same relative camera angle. Once you learn how to aim and shoot one gun, you've learned how to aim and shoot all the guns in this game. But the Scorpion tank, it's different. Normally a difference like this, I would consider that bad game design. But it works here. An experienced player can appreciate the power of the tank without being able to leverage its full potential. This subtle change forces the player to slightly adjust their playstyle and muscle memory. Put another way, it increases the skill ceiling of the game, which drives players to try and get better at the tool, which drives gameplay. This is an example of how good games tend to follow the general game design principles, while great games take risks from time to time and break these rules. But it's important to know the rules before you break them, so that you can break them intentionally and not on accident. So while the Scorpion tank is fun to use, it doesn't trivialize things. In other words, it solves some problems but introduces some new challenges too. This is a really good example of power creep. Now that the player understands how challenging it is to kill a hunter, it's really satisfying to kill it in one hit. But this power comes at a cost. Poor defense and easy death if the player misses or stands still. A new toy should solve some old challenges while also presenting new problems for the player. Every asset should have its strengths and weaknesses, and there should be other game objects that exploit or are vulnerable to the original asset. Justify an asset by finding a place for it to fit in the broader ecology of the game. As a final note on the tank, players have a unique ability of getting assets stuck or into positions that the developers were not expecting. So it's important to give the player the ability to get their toy unstuck. Another new piece of content is the Ghost. Now, there will be more opportunities to talk about the Ghost in detail later, but for now I just want to focus on how the devs introduce new content, like this and the tank. At first, the Ghost plays a supporting role. It's there primarily to support the introduction of the Scorpion tank. Notice the first encounter the player is exposed to after getting the tank is this large playground, complete with hunters, elite, stationary guns, banshees, and yes, ghosts, along with these other alien tanks called wraiths. The Ghost is the foil, or opposite companion of the Scorpion tank. While the tank is slow and has poor maneuverability, the Ghost is fast and nimble. So from the tank's perspective, the Ghost vehicle provides a fun challenge. Picking off a fast-moving target like the Ghost is fun and different from the typical playstyle of run and gun associated with Halo. It's pretty clear here that the Ghosts are used as target practice for the tank. Near the end of the game, however, a similar playground is set up, but this time it's set up for the Ghost, not the tank. Cortana even tells the player to commandeer a Ghost, so the developers have designed this entire area with the assumption that a player will be riding in this new toy. And this is the lesson that I want to point out. When introducing new content or mechanics, it is important to design an area for the player to use the new tool. Back with the Scorpion tank, there were several solid encounters that were clearly designed for the Scorpion tank. And the devs even introduced the Ghost vehicle as a unique challenge for the tank to take on. Then, later, the devs put the Ghost in the spotlight and provided an area that highlights the Ghost's small size and excellent handling. Also worth noting here is that the debris does an intentionally poor job of blocking the player. Stuff like this makes the player feel like they've found an exploit or are getting away with something, which is a fun feeling. So in summary, simply giving a new toy to the player isn't enough. You also have to set up the game around that toy to give the player the opportunity to use it. But that's enough for this level. Complex linear design, supply cache design, healthy power scaling as demonstrated by the Scorpion tank, and how to introduce new content effectively to an experienced player. In the next episode, instead of introducing a player to a new tool, the devs introduce the player to a new challenge. A challenge of biblical proportions. A great flood of challenges. I'll see you there.